So what is fiscal policy? What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is simply a fancy term to say, how does the government spend money and how do they raise money? That's all it is. It's a fancy term for saying, how does the government spend money and where do they get the money from? So what does a government generally spend money on? They spend money on things like education, they spend money on things like health. Hopefully they're building some infrastructure. They have to pay the police and teachers and nurses and doctors. These are the important things that any government spends money on. Where do they get that money? Where do they get that money? Most governments get the bulk of their money by way of taxes. That's where the bulk of their money comes from. But frequently, those taxes are not enough. So the second major source of government funding is borrowing. The government goes and it borrows money. And it borrows money by issuing pieces of paper called bonds. They borrow the money, give people pieces of paper, and that piece of paper says the government promises to pay back that money in, let's say, 5 years or 10 years' time. And in the interim, the government will pay those people an interest rate, what we call a bond coupon. It's effectively an interest rate. So that's all fiscal policy is. It's how the government spends money and where they get that money from, how they raise the revenue. They raise the revenue through taxes and they supplement it with borrowings. And they spend the money on the different government obligations. Now you have to be very, very careful with fiscal policy because different political parties have got different fiscal priorities. So some parties will say, would rather spend more money on X and less money on Y. Other parties will tend to differ. That's on the expenditure side. Similarly, on the revenue generation side, some political parties will say, let's tax companies more. Others will say, let's tax them less. Let's borrow more, let's borrow less. Each of those parties have a fiscal policy. They're all fiscal policies. But different political parties, different people have different priorities. They have different ideas in terms of how they think government should spend money and how government should raise money. And that's why these politicians call each other nasty names. That is all fiscal policy is. How the government spends money and where they raise the revenue to fund that expenditure.